Tonight, world leaders slapping the United States with more new tariffs as layoffs start in the global auto industry.
Donald Trump's new economic world order is taking shape as his so-called reciprocal tariffs on 60 countries, which the US president calls the worst offenders, have just kicked in.
Jeep, Dodge, and Ram just shut down production in the US, and no one is telling you the full story. Thousands of workers were sent home, dealership lots wiped clean, and behind it all, a decision made quietly, under the cover of tariffs, cost-cutting, and political spin. This wasn't an accident, it was a calculation, and the fallout is already hitting your paycheck, your street, and your future. So who made the call to pull the plug? Why now when the industry was finally recovering? And how far will the damage go? Because by the end of this video you'll understand, this isn't just about trucks. It's about everything we were promised, suddenly disappearing. The shutdown heard through silence. It didn't start with an explosion. It started with silence. At the Jeep Belvidere assembly plant in northern Illinois, workers showed up for what should have been an ordinary shift. The lines were supposed to hum, the machines to cycle, and the chatter of routine to echo through the halls. But instead, a notice was pinned to the glass at the entrance, and a manager's voice cracked through the speaker system. Do not clock in. Report to your supervisor. That was it. 30 years of labor, gone before the lights even warmed up. Some cried. Others stood frozen. No speeches, no warnings, just the sudden void of work. The plant, which once rolled out the Jeep Cherokee by the hundreds every day, now stood dormant. In nearby diners and gas stations, the ripple hit almost instantly. Tips dried up, orders stopped coming. Kids stopped getting dropped off at daycare because their parents no longer had anywhere to go. What was supposed to be a protective reshoring effort had instead drawn a chalk outline around one of America's longest-standing industrial employers. The layoffs were not formal. They were whispered, leaked, texted in chain messages between employees who had no one else to ask. One veteran with 24 years on the floor simply said, "It felt like being erased." The company called it a temporary pause, but no one believed that. It wasn't just the assembly line that had stopped. It was the heartbeat of a town. And then the silence deepened. HR stopped answering calls. Union reps offered no timelines, and the cafeteria cleared out. This wasn't a routine layoff. It was the start of something much worse. But the shock in Belvidere was just the first crack. Behind closed doors, the entire corporate strategy was beginning to collapse. Stalantis in reverse. They had a plan. They just hoped it wouldn't be tested. In the sleek air-conditioned offices of Stalantis headquarters, senior executives sat around a glass table, watching trade policy unravel the future they thought they controlled. For 2 years, they had gambled that tariffs would be temporary, that President Donald Trump's threats were for negotiation leverage, not lasting legislation. But when the 25% tariffs were signed into law, every spreadsheet they had relied on turned toxic. The strategy had been simple. Keep key assembly lines in Mexico and Canada for cost efficiency. Then lean on US branding and dealership networks to keep the illusion of domestic production strong. But the tariffs hit everything. Steel, semiconductors, axles, dashboards, seats. Every bolt brought across the border came with a new cost. And by the time they tried to pivot, it was too late. Components were stuck in customs. Legal teams scrambled to file exemptions. Suppliers missed payments. And the margin? Gone. Inside the boardroom, there was no consensus. Some pushed for emergency hiring in Indiana and Ohio. Others argued for slashing output entirely and preserving cash. But the paralysis was telling. Stalantis was built for scale, not agility. And agility was the only thing that could save them now. Production forecasts were quietly revised downward. Entire vehicle programs, like the next-generation Dodge Charger and Ram mid-size truck, were put on hold. Marketing campaigns were pulled. PR teams were told to say nothing. And behind the optimism on earnings calls, they were canceling futures in real time. Still, if boardrooms were confused, the federal response was something else entirely. Confident, indifferent, and deafeningly bold. The tariff that didn't protect anyone. It was sold as protection, but turned into a wrecking ball. When President Donald Trump unveiled the 25% tariff on all vehicles and components imported from outside the United States, the rhetoric was simple. Bring manufacturing home. On the surface, it sounded like a call to arms, a populist promise to rebuild the Rust Belt and punish foreign exploitation. But the economic mechanism he unleashed didn't strike overseas competitors first. It hit American factories in their weakest joints: Stalantis, Ford, General Motors. They all rely on a North American supply web that stretches through thousands of suppliers across 3 borders. The parts are built in Mexico, assembled in the United States, and shipped to Canada for finishing touches. Trump's tariff policy didn't just charge imports, it shattered integration. What was once a seamless flow of goods became a bureaucratic maze of penalties, delays, and spiraling costs. Every delay killed cash flow. Every increase in duty gouged the bottom line. And yet, when the media asked President Trump whether he was concerned about the auto layoffs, he did not hesitate. "This was expected," he said. "They should have brought production back years ago. This is about America first." The markets trembled. Executives scrambled, but the policy didn't shift an inch. For the workers losing their jobs in Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois, the message was clear. They were on the wrong side of a war meant to save them. And the president's reaction? He called it a necessary correction. But if Washington wasn't panicking, local businesses had no such luxury. The shock was already flooding the front lines of America's auto economy, its dealerships. When jobs move like poker chips, someone always loses. We follow the moves they don't announce. If you care about who wins and who's left behind, hit that subscribe button. Because we're not done pulling back the curtain. When the showroom went dark, the customers didn't leave. The cars did. In small towns and mid-sized cities across America, Dodge and Ram dealerships started noticing something strange in late March. Orders were being canceled. Truck shipments delayed. Sales reps had nothing left to pitch. By early April, the lot that once held 24 Ram 1500s now had just 4. And even those were being held for high credit buyers only. No one could explain what was happening at first. Then the memos started circulating. Pricing updates, inventory freezes, financing restrictions. It wasn't just a supply issue, it was a chain reaction. Tariff-induced price hikes meant the vehicles were more expensive to deliver, more expensive to finance, and increasingly impossible to keep on hand. Dealerships in Texas, Ohio, and Georgia all reported the same story. Sticker prices were jumping by $2,000 to $3,000, sometimes overnight. Customers who had come in for a mid-trim Durango were being told it would now cost as much as a high-end competitor from Hyundai or Ford. Most walked out. Dealers begged for clarity, but Stalantis couldn't give any. Production timelines were frozen. No one could say when new models would arrive. Used inventory was drying up, and trade-ins couldn't be resold fast enough to keep the lights on. In some regions, dealerships laid off front office staff just to survive. For brands built on accessibility and working-class loyalty, the betrayal felt personal. These weren't luxury vehicles for coastal elites. These were trucks for farmers, builders, and families, and they were disappearing. And in showrooms once filled with Ram 1500s and Challengers, now only silence that wouldn't last much longer. The union finally snapped. The United Auto Workers had watched the Stalantis collapse from a distance, until distance was no longer possible. After decades of backroom deals, calculated compromises, and handshake extensions, the silence from the boardroom became a declaration of war. When the layoffs hit in waves, with zero warning and zero severance, the union had no choice left. They went public, and loud. At a press conference in Detroit, flanked by furloughed workers and shouting retirees, UAW leadership issued a direct rebuke. Stalantis, they said, had violated the spirit of the collective agreement. They accused the company of using tariffs as an excuse to gut labor, while preserving profits for shareholders. They pointed to closed factories, delayed wages, and vanishing benefits as proof of betrayal. But it wasn't just talk. The union organized emergency strike authorizations across affected plants. They launched digital campaigns, lobbied Congress, and, perhaps most tellingly, called for federal intervention into what they described as corporate negligence, dressed up as policy compliance. Inside the plants still operating, morale fractured. Workers feared retaliation. Supervisors avoided eye contact. The relationship between management and labor, already brittle, snapped entirely. Union halls filled with resentment. And outside those halls, workers who had once worn Stalantis logos like badges of honor now held protest signs in the rain. And for the first time in years, the union wasn't negotiating. It was fighting back. As the unions rallied in the streets, another battle was unfolding across the borderlines. Shift swap. One plant lives, another dies. At first, it looked like a win. Stalantis announced it would be expanding production in Fort Wayne, Indiana, adding 200 jobs to support Ram truck assembly. Press releases spoke of reshoring, resilience, and American competitiveness. Local officials cut ribbons. Workers cheered. Economic development offices touted the success in every email blast and interview. But what the company didn't mention was the cost. To make room for the Indiana ramp-up, Stalantis had quietly mothballed its Windsor, Ontario plant. For the second time in under 18 months, shipments of powertrains from Mexico were delayed indefinitely. Brampton, where Dodge Chargers and Challengers were built, saw 250 workers laid off in a single week. Canadian unions accused Stalantis of using U.S. policy as a pretext for cross-border job raids. And in Mexico, stamping plant workers staged walkouts after their overtime was slashed without notice. It was a shell game, shuffling jobs from one region to another under the banner of domestic recovery. But to the workers who were suddenly unemployed, it didn't feel like recovery. It felt like betrayal. In Fort Wayne, a second shift started. In Windsor, lights went off. And while Fort Wayne added jobs, Windsor lost its future. The real pressure wasn't from across borders. It was rising from within America's own political core, when the governors called Washington. By early summer, the impact of the shutdowns was unavoidable. In Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, auto layoffs had triggered ripple effects that reached far beyond the factories. Small towns were seeing budget shortfalls. Food banks were overwhelmed. Local tax revenue evaporated as auto payrolls disappeared. Governors and mayors began demanding answers and action. Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan held an emergency press conference, urging the White House to reconsider tariff enforcement or risk long-term economic damage to America's industrial heartland. Indiana's governor submitted a formal appeal requesting exemptions for high-value suppliers. Toledo's mayor publicly pleaded with Congress to extend unemployment benefits for displaced auto workers. They sent letters. They sent delegations. They made calls. But none of it made a dent. When asked by reporters about the Stalantis layoffs and plant idlings, President Trump was blunt. They should have brought production home a long time ago, he said. These companies had decades to do the right thing. The administration insisted the tariffs were working as intended. That temporary pain would lead to long-term gain. But on the ground, there was no gain. Only job loss, political backlash, and public fury. And then Trump left for a campaign stop, without answering a single call. As Washington turned its back, the workers, the unions, and the communities had only one question left. Who was next? The supply chain no one can rebuild. For decades, the North American auto industry was a case study in seamless integration. Engines assembled in Ontario were married to transmissions from Mexico, joined together with steel frames molded in Ohio, and finished in sleek, digitized interiors crafted in Tennessee. It was not just efficient, it was a masterpiece. Built on the promises of the North American Free Trade Agreement, automakers learned to move parts across borders faster than most governments could sign legislation. It was a dance choreographed over 30 years, involving hundreds of suppliers, tens of thousands of trucks, and factories that ran on to-the-minute deliveries. But that dance is now over. In the span of 12 months, a 3-decade supply chain was fractured. By policy, by tariffs, and by political short-termism masquerading as patriotism. The tariffs, initiated as a 25% penalty on imported vehicles and components, were supposed to wound competitors abroad. Instead, they detonated the very infrastructure American companies relied on to compete globally. Stalantis, like its peers, had optimized every inch of its production pipeline for speed and cross-border efficiency. Brake calipers from Chihuahua, wiring harnesses from Ontario, seats from Saltillo. Now every border crossing added cost, delay, and paperwork. Components that once arrived in 18 hours were now backlogged for days. But it was not just about speed. The cost multipliers were devastating. A Ram 1500 built using pre-tariff components cost $38,000. Now, with the tariff burden, that same truck demanded a sticker price closer to $47,000. And Stalantis was still losing margin. Rebuilding a domestic-only supply chain sounds patriotic, but it is strategically suicidal. No single country can match the efficiency of the integrated triad the industry had come to rely on. Suppliers are not widgets. They are ecosystems in themselves. And the moment trust is lost, the network does not bend, it breaks. What Stalantis, Ford, and General Motors are facing now is not just disruption, it is unmaking. And you cannot rewire 3 decades in 3 quarters. While Stalantis was unraveling, its rivals were already moving. Stalantis stalls, while everyone else moves. In boardrooms across the country, auto executives face the same data. Skyrocketing component costs, customer pushback on pricing, and a logistics system in revolt. But what separated the survivors from the shaken was not what they saw. It was how they responded. Ford, bloodied but agile, pivoted fast. It doubled down on US-based truck production, moved key components stateside, and announced investment shifts toward its Kentucky and Michigan plants. It hurt, but it moved. General Motors took a more flexible approach, retrofitting plants in Fort Wayne and Arlington to handle supply constraints, reassigning engineers to redesign platforms around domestic parts, and renegotiating contracts with third-tier suppliers before panic set in. And then there was Stalantis. While others retooled, Stalantis waited. While Ford raised prices and explained it, Stalantis said nothing. While GM reshuffled its investment calendar, Stalantis froze its hiring altogether. The company's internal posture was simple: wait it out. Executives bet that tariffs would soften, that political pressure would fade, and that loyal customers would tolerate the silence. But none of that happened. What did happen was erosion of dealer trust, of supply reliability, of customer patience. Jeep shipments slowed, Dodge Challenger inventory vanished, and Ram trucks faced 6-week backlogs with no parts in sight. Toyota, meanwhile, had taken a different approach entirely. Already conservative with offshoring, it leveraged its hybrid lineup and Asian-based battery partnerships to reduce reliance on tariff-vulnerable components. It watched as American rivals stumbled and waited with its production flexibility intact. Stalantis, by contrast, remained motionless while the terrain beneath it shifted. By the time Stalantis began drafting recovery memos, Ford and GM were already 3 phases into adaptation. And by the time they blinked, the game had already changed. Wall Street wasn't about to wait for them to catch up. Wall Street pulls the trigger. The markets tolerated a lot in 2024. Interest rate hikes, chip shortages, an electric vehicle plateau. But what triggered a sector-wide panic was not just factory shutdowns, it was Stellantis' silence. When the automaker failed to reassure analysts during its second quarter earnings call, investor confidence vaporized, and the moment Moody's downgraded its credit outlook from stable to negative, it triggered a ripple effect that made the layoffs look like prelude. Supplier shares cratered within 48 hours. Companies like Aptiv, Magna, and Dana, all with deep ties to Stellantis' parts pipeline, saw double-digit drops. Smaller vendors, especially those with single customer dependency, began issuing warnings. Credit insurance tightened. Cash flow forecasts were slashed. The industry wasn't just watching a slowdown. It was witnessing systemic stress. Numbers were ruthless. Stellantis' market cap dropped by over $16 billion in less than 1 month. Brokerages warned clients to reduce exposure. Investment banks cut their targets. But beyond the market metrics, the real damage was in trust. Stalantis had cultivated a brand identity around muscular resilience. Ram, Jeep, Dodge were American toughness personified. Now that identity was compromised. Investors hate silence almost as much as they hate surprises, and Stalantis delivered both. Internal documents leaked to the press showed project delays across nearly 20 models. Hybrid upgrades were postponed. EV tooling projects paused. Global expansion plans shelved. Meanwhile, Ford used its earnings call to announce a forward-looking domestic production strategy. GM revealed a revised capital expenditure model that investors interpreted as realism in motion. But Stalantis offered little more than guidance withdrawals and muted press releases. The sell-off wasn't the reaction, it was the verdict. And the sell-off hadn't even reached its bottom. In Beijing and Brussels, retaliation was already being written. China hits back. American tariffs were never going to go unanswered. Within 6 months of Washington's policy shift, China struck back, imposing reciprocal duties on U.S.-made cars, trucks, and auto parts. For Stalantis, the timing could not have been worse. Shipments of Jeep Grand Cherokees bound for Shanghai sat dockside, reclassified under new tariff lines that added over 30% to their price. Overnight, the Chinese distributor network paused all further orders. European governments soon followed, signaling reviews of U.S. automotive import treatment in response to Trump's America First declarations. In export terms, the damage was immediate. Stalantis saw a 65% drop in exports to China from the U.S. market in a single quarter. Jeep Renegades and Grand Wagoneers were redirected, then warehoused. Dodge Challengers and Chargers, once prized abroad for their raw Americana, were priced out of their segments. And in key European markets, dealers began shifting to Korean and German brands whose logistics were insulated from trade warfare. But China's blow was not just economic. It was symbolic. By targeting brands like Jeep and Dodge, symbols of American road culture, it sent a message. U.S. industry no longer had immunity. Trade retaliation used to be tit for tat. This time it was scalp for scalp. The consequences spread fast. Joint ventures in Asia began revisiting terms. South American partnerships asked for clause renegotiations. Foreign investors quietly pulled from Stalantis' international marketing budgets. And even long-standing battery partners began raising prices or demanding hedges. It was not just a market correction, it was a reputational fracture. And the Ram trucks meant for Shanghai? Still sitting in Detroit. As global confidence evaporated, Stalantis was left to fight on shrinking ground. America's last cheap truck just got expensive. Last year, a base model Ram 1500 could be had for $38,000. This week, $47,000. And for tens of millions of working-class Americans, that difference is more than a statistic. It's a barrier. What was once the backbone of rural America's garages and job sites is now creeping out of reach for the very people it was built for. Across dealership lots in Indiana, Ohio, and the Carolinas, buyers who once planned their year around pickup shopping are now walking away in disbelief. This isn't about luxury trims or optional add-ons. This is about entry-level work trucks and base model sedans. Vehicles that used to be affordable to people living on $50,000 to $60,000 a year. With tariffs stacking an extra 25% on cross-border components, Ram has quietly pushed pricing to record levels. The Dodge Charger, once a symbol of no-frills power, now starts closer to $42,000. The Jeep Grand Cherokee, $51,000. And it is not just the vehicles themselves. Insurance rates have risen. Loan approval criteria have tightened. Down payments are climbing as banks try to shield themselves from auto loan risk. In communities already struggling with rising rent, food costs, and medical bills, this new car pricing wave isn't just inconvenient. It's economically devastating. Dealerships now report higher foot traffic paired with lower contract signing. That means customers are looking, but they're not buying. For many, the numbers simply no longer work. The American truck, long marketed as accessible and essential, is slowly becoming a luxury item in disguise. And while buyers reevaluate their plans, automakers are watching demand shrink where it matters most. But this pricing problem? It's only one part of a much deeper freeze. Stellantis freezes the electric future. The Ram REV was supposed to be the headline act of a new era. Stellantis' electric crown jewel. Their answer to Ford's F-150 Lightning and Tesla's Cybertruck. It was promised, previewed, hyped, and heavily teased in auto shows from Detroit to Dubai. But now, it's on ice. Not officially canceled, not openly delayed, just quietly frozen. Internally, Stalantis has paused not just the Ram REV, but also rollout timelines for the Dodge Charger Daytona EV, and even early Jeep Recon development. They're not killing the future. They're putting it in the garage and walking away. The reason? Economics. The very tariffs that made foreign parts more expensive have also throttled battery supply lines, with lithium, cobalt, and nickel facing multi-country taxes and regulatory slowdowns. Battery prices have climbed by over 17% in less than 9 months. Add in rising labor costs and weakened consumer demand, and Stellantis is facing a brutal truth. Their electric lineup is no longer financially viable in the short term. The executives aren't saying it out loud, but the dealers know. Orders are being pushed back. Marketing campaigns are shrinking. Factory retooling has slowed or stopped altogether. Even supplier contracts, many signed during the EV boom of 2021, are now under renegotiation or outright canceled. This retreat doesn't just hurt Stellantis, it hurts the entire domestic EV transition. When one of the big three steps back, it signals caution to investors, suppliers, and policymakers alike. And for a moment, that was supposed to mark the turning point away from fossil fuels. This feels more like a stall than a sprint. But while new EVs are stalling, the used market is boiling. And not in a good way. The market may cool eventually. But for now, it's punishing the exact people who depend on their vehicles to survive. And through all of this, there's one question echoing across shop floors and factory gates. One question no executive wants to answer. The final question no one wants to answer. He started working at the Toledo assembly plant in 1989. By the time he hit his 30th year, he had trained over 100 younger workers, helped implement 3 model changeovers, and watched his plant win awards for quality and output. He never asked for recognition. He just asked for a job that lasted. But now, retired and watching Stalantis unravel from his living room, he's asking the one question no politician wants to hear. Was it worth it? Gave the company everything. His time, his health, his body. He lost a disc in his back building Grand Cherokees. He missed his daughter's graduation for a midnight shift. He paid union dues and attended every vote. And still, the plant he helped build is laying off its next generation. The line that supported his family now leads nowhere. In his community, the fallout is everywhere. The diner near the plant closed. The barber who cut shifts on Thursdays moved to find new clients. The auto parts shop replaced by a dollar store. For decades, factories like his didn't just build cars. They built lives, identities, and pride. That pride is now being hollowed out by decisions made in boardrooms, justified in press conferences, and spun by political consultants. He doesn't speak in numbers or forecasts. He speaks in names. People who lost jobs, kids who dropped out of college, friends who drank too much when their shift got cut. He's not asking for a bailout. He's asking for honesty. If your factory went silent, your job vanished, or your belief in American industry just took a hit, you are not alone. Drop your story in the comments. Subscribe if you believe someone should be telling these truths, because this collapse, it's far from over.